Gordon, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and let me too acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Noongar people, and pay my respects, as we do in Canberra, to elders past, present and emerging. It's great to be back in Perth, and Gordon, can I just say that last time I was at the Perth US Asia Centre was in fact 4 years ago, almost to the day. But of course Perth is Australia's Indian Ocean capital, and it's great to be working again with the Perth US Asia Centre. And I want to acknowledge, Gordon, your impressively active leadership and focus on the big issues, and I think you've really put the Perth US Asia Centre on the map. I think initially people wondered, Perth, US, Asia, how does that all work centre? And you've made it all work extremely well. I mean, it's become a lively intellectual home at the University of Western Australia, and I want to acknowledge that it's ably overseen by board member and Vice-Chancellor Professor Dawn Freshwater, who I believe has been over in Sydney at the UNSW speech given by the PM that you mentioned earlier. Also on the board, of course, is the new Governor of Western Australia, His Excellency Kim Beazley AC, a true Perth native who has had an unparalleled career in public service, at least in modern times. After a rich life in politics that saw him at the centre of Australia's international and domestic policy through one of our most tumultuous and ultimately successful decades, and later as leader of the opposition in the Howard years, Kim gave Australia another 6 years as one of our most influential ambassadors to the United States. And now he's serving again, this time as Western Australia's Governor, a role to which he brings, as always, his trademark intelligence and his gentle decency. I acknowledge Perth US Asia Centre board members, the Honourable John Olsen, AO, who also chairs the American Australian Association, and Professor Stephen Smith, former Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence. And I also want to acknowledge, as I really can only in this city, the role that Stephen played in my education during the 2 years I had the privilege to be his Chief of Staff. Coming from South Australia, working in Canberra, I had a particular view of Australia's geography and our place in the world, and I want you to know that Stephen radically changed that through no less a direct device than having all of his overseas trips, wherever he was going in the world, leave from Perth. So I have crisscrossed this country more times than I would care to imagine, but annoyingly, and I can say now annoyingly, wherever we were leaving from, certainly Middle East, Europe, he would get home at least 4 hours before I would. We'd leave Dubai or Abu Dhabi at exactly the same time, and I'd still be struggling across to Sydney only to get on another plane to Canberra. So I think he knew it would be a formative experience, and I now, almost 10 years later, Stephen, want to acknowledge that it was. Let me, though, thank Gordon and his capable team, because you're the people who make the centre hum, and I can see just already from my contact with your staff that they really do make it hum. And it's because of you and them that Australia has now a genuinely Indo-Pacific foreign policy debate. A debate also championed, I want to acknowledge, by Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, who I know is also a strong supporter of the centre. She certainly seems to encourage every single Australian ambassador to make sure that they have contact with the centre on their way through Perth. Of course, you don't need a South Australian to tell you, but I will anyway, that Western Australia has had a long history of forging its own way in the Indo-Pacific, whatever those of us back east were doing at the time. In the 1840s, Western Australia was already exporting sandalwood to China and through Singapore, and exports of jarrah to India followed. When this much-loved building, and I now understand why, opened to the public in 1870, it became the centre of Perth's vibrant civic life. While for another couple of generations, sheep had the run of the paddocks 1,900 miles to the east that would become the nation's capital. It's no exaggeration to say that in the 19th century, Western Australia led in transformative infrastructure for engaging with the world. Under C.Y. O'Connor's leadership, Western Australians built Fremantle's inner harbour, this continent's best connection to Singapore, the Middle East, Europe and Africa. No wonder Western Australians seriously considered going it alone. In 1900, though, in this very building, Mrs. Bateson compared the prospect of federation to the rabbit plague. Both would bring pests that were better kept out, she warned. However, a continent for a nation and a nation for a continent had an irresistible logic. While federation has always had its Westralian critics, this state has simply got on with making a success of Australia and Australia in the world. We've seen that under governments of both stripes. Bob Hawke and Hu Yaobang, the Chinese Communist Party General Secretary in 1987, sealing China's first major overseas investment deal at Mount Channa. The Gorgon LNG project, the largest single resource project in Australia's history. The Ichthys project with INPEX of Japan, the largest discovery of hydrocarbon liquids in Australia in 40 years, with the world's largest semi-submersible platform, of which Foreign Minister Julie Bishop is the official godmother. You may have heard that before. I regularly hear it, I have to say, including during a recent visit to Korea. WA has been there at the heart of our engagement with the Indo-Pacific for decades. Consider the grip you've had on foreign affairs, thanks to Stephen Smith and now Julie Bishop, who between them have served as Australia's Foreign Minister for 7.5 of the past 10 years. Perhaps it's no coincidence then that these have been the years when Australia actively broadened its central foreign policy focus from the Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. In our foreign policy white paper published last November, the Australian government explained the trends that are shaping the Indo-Pacific and indeed the world. These trends, I'd have to say, have accelerated markedly in recent months. This year, China has made it very clear, if it had not done so already, that it will pursue a unique political and economic trajectory with new authority concentrated in the hands of President and General Secretary Xi Jinping. China continues to demonstrate its determination and ability to influence our region. But it's not the only mover, and I should also say shaker. As the Foreign Minister said last month at Chatham House in London, the United States is, and I quote, now favouring a more disruptive, often unilateral foreign and trade policy that has heightened anxieties about its commitment to the rules-based order that it established, protected and guaranteed, end quote. Of course, Australia is not alone in recognising and responding to these major strategic shifts. Japan and India are pursuing their own Indo-Pacific strategies with a view to maximising their influence at this pivotal time. The next 10 years will be vital ones for Australia and our region. International norms and rules that have served us well are under pressure. The Australian government will continue to speak up in defence of a rules-based order. We will engage in that order and seek to ensure that it serves our interests. We will also promote and support reform and modernisation of international institutions where that is warranted. We're confident but not complacent in this task. Many nations agree with our central proposition that the formula of a rules-based order, the peaceful settlement of disputes and open markets have proven its worth. These remain the principles that most nations want to entrench in the Indo-Pacific. They're principles that guide us as we develop mutually beneficial relations with our partners in the region. I'd like to say a little bit about relations with the United States and China. At this time of change, there is much in Australia's relations with the United States that provides reassurance. Now, you might be surprised to hear me put it that way, but I firmly believe it. Last month, our foreign and defence ministers met their US counterparts in Palo Alto on the US Pacific coast. It was the 28th of these annual meetings, for which we use the term AUSMIN. They began in 1985 with Paul Hayden, Kim Beazley, George Shultz, and Admiral Crowe at the table in Canberra. This time it was Julie Bishop, Maurice Payne, Jim Mattis, and Mike Pompeo. The consistency and longevity of AUSMIN says a lot about the priority both sides place on the relationship. The list of outcomes this year was broad and activist. Our leaders agreed to work closely on many of the most pressing concerns facing our Indo-Pacific region. A few days later, Secretary of State Pompeo gave a speech entitled America's Indo-Pacific Vision. He said that business engagement is at the centre of the US vision for the region, that the US government does not tell business what to do, but if you open a map of the Indo-Pacific today, quote, it is dotted with US public and private efforts to foster self-reliance, build institutions, and promote private sector growth, unquote. Mr. Pompeo's speech reinforced themes that Defence Secretary Mattis set out at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in June. Both underlined the fact that the United States seeks to uphold the sovereignty and independence of all nations, large or small, in our region. It is one of Australia's great strategic assets that the world's major power shares many of our fundamental values, is a close military ally, and our foremost investment partner by a wide margin. Now, it has to be said that there are some important issues on which we've made our disagreement very clear to the United States government, including major international agreements on trade and climate. Even because we can disagree openly, our strong partnership with the United States is a cornerstone of our foreign policy. At the same time, our relations with China are increasingly prominent, given the range and significance of our interests and their growth over the past decade. Western Australians will be keenly aware of the trade and investment links in resources. The economic relationship is now broadening to agribusiness, tourism, and other sectors. But China's beneficial impact on Australia goes beyond commerce. The flow into Australia of students, tourists, and migrants from China is a brain drain in Australia's favour. The education relationship is one of Australia's outstanding opportunities, as the Prime Minister said in his speech at the University of New South Wales today. Increasing numbers of Chinese students have been choosing to live and study in Western Australia in recent years. There was a jump of enrolments of over 10% last year. Some 5% of Australia's population overall, about 1.2 million Australians, are of Chinese heritage, of whom about 500,000 were born in mainland China. But we have other fundamental interests in the relationship with China, including maintaining political dialogue and working to uphold regional stability. We work with China on strengthening the international trading system through the World Trade Organization, on international cooperation to mitigate climate change, on limiting and reversing the proliferation of weapons, including nuclear weapons. There are many facets of our relationship with China and many stakeholders in our institutions and community. The business community has particular interests, but also particular insights into the relationship. As DFAT Secretary, I'm committed to developing dialogue between business and government that takes forward our mutual interests in security and commerce. It is important that we bring these perspectives together. I welcome the Western Australian Government's work to expand its trade and investment links with China, promoting sister state ties with Chinese provinces and encouraging director air services. Ultimately, though, the Australian Government must manage all of our interests in our relationship with China and do so in a coherent manner. Unsurprisingly, There are areas where Australia and China do not see eye to eye. We're upfront about these and about promoting our interests. We do so in a straightforward and respectful manner. The foundation of the relationship remains shared interests in stability and prosperity, and the extensive mutual benefit from our interactions. Australia and China have a genuine partnership with strong potential for growth across the board. Let me now turn to the Indo-Pacific, to developments there and to the international trading system. The government is concerned, naturally, about the direction of trade relations between China and the United States. We encourage the United States and China to resolve differences on trade through the World Trade Organization. Under the Trump administration, the United States has changed tack on trade policy, withdrawing or threatening to withdraw from liberalising trade deals and adopting protectionist measures aimed at China. But it's important that we keep this in perspective. US firms will continue to have a welcome influence across the Indo-Pacific, as will US-backed international economic institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. US economic activity will continue to benefit the Indo-Pacific region through the normal market operations and without any government branding or indeed grandstanding. As Mr. Pompeo said in setting out the US vision for the Indo-Pacific, in Southeast Asia, the US is the single largest source of cumulative foreign investment, larger than China, Japan, and the European Union. The Australian government has made it clear that we believe that open, liberal trade and investment settings best serve regional prosperity. Australia has succeeded in harnessing the benefits of trade and investment and distributing them so that people in all 5 income bands have seen their real incomes rise between 19 and 27% over the 10 years to 2015-2016. As Trade, Tourism and Investment Minister Stephen Ciobo said in Melbourne last month, the free trade agreements we currently have in force or have concluded and are still to enter into force cover more than 2/3 of our trade today. Once we've included negotiations currently underway, 90% of our trade will be covered by free trade rules and commitments, which gives us a tremendous edge in markets where we might otherwise struggle. The 11-country Trans-Pacific Partnership was a major step forward. It demonstrated the breadth of support for progressive free trade agenda in our region. Not only did the 11 countries agree to lower tariffs, they also agreed rules for digital trade and contemporary arrangements for competition, including with respect to state-owned enterprises. We are now working on bringing the agreement into force. I expect it will come into force early next year. Looking further ahead, we are intensifying efforts to conclude the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which covers 16 Indo-Pacific economies, including 10 of Australia's top 15 trading partners. The Australian government will continue to pursue and achieve liberalising trade agreements in our region and beyond, with that ultimate goal of a region-wide open free trade area. For good reason, though, we're working harder than ever on trade integration with Indian Ocean partners. Business and the general public have, I think, fully factored in the very large economic growth we can expect from China in the next decade or so. I'm not sure, though, that as a nation, it may be different here in WA, but I'm not sure that as a nation we fully grasp the implications of India and Indonesia's growth trajectories, even a decade after Stephen Smith repeatedly drew the nation's attention to it. We must do more to engage with our rising Indian Ocean partners, and we are. WA's CBH Group is showing the way in Indonesia. Through its joint venture with Indonesia's Interfoods, CBH operates flour mills in Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia and Turkey, a grain port terminal in Vietnam and a malting house in Vietnam. Government is working hard to conclude negotiations on a free trade agreement with Indonesia, the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. I spoke to our lead negotiator about this yesterday in Canberra, and she thinks we're probably this close, which is closer than we've ever been before. Western Australia is Australia's largest exporter to Indonesia, so our trade negotiators can thank Western Australian farmers for demonstrating the mutual benefits of trade between our two countries. Looking west and further north, there is a great deal that governments can do to increase economic relations with India, even before India is ready to conclude negotiations for a trade agreement. If we're this close with Indonesia, we're probably like that with India, but we'll get there eventually. Last month, the Prime Minister released Australia's India Economic Strategy, an independent report by Peter Varghese, my predecessor as DFAT Secretary and a former High Commissioner to India. The report judges that no single market over the next 20 years will offer more growth opportunities for Australia than India. It identifies 10 priority states for Australian engagement. Western Australia was the first Australian state to open a trade and investment office in India, in Mumbai, in 1996, a city that is now home to more than 46,000 millionaires in India's most economically advanced state, Maharashtra. In 2016, WA established its sister state relationships with Andhra Pradesh, which leads India's ease of doing business rankings. And for anyone who's been visiting India recently, you'll know there's a genuine competition amongst the states around ease of doing business, with some quite remarkable improvements. The resources and energy sector in Andhra Pradesh is a strong match for Australia's capabilities in mining, METS and renewable energies. Across the Australian government, we continue to build our presence in India. In May, the Foreign Minister announced that we'll open a new diplomatic post in Kolkata, a hub for India's mineral-rich eastern states, and likely to be in the top 10 fastest growing cities in Asia out to 2021. As Steve Chobo said in Melbourne last week, it's time for these states and the others in the strategy's top 10 to become household names in Australia. The strategy also identifies the top 10 sectors where Australia has a competitive advantage, including education, agribusiness, resources, and tourism. India is a diverse and in some ways difficult market, but there are profound complementarities for Australia, and the strategy points the way, all the way out to 2030. It also conveys the urgency of the challenge. Australian business will have to compete to be part of India's rise, and there will be advantages in moving sooner rather than later. Looking still further west, this city and this state are leading the way in engaging that continent of opportunity and promise, Africa. Perth's Australia-Africa Week is our premier engagement with Africa, with the Africa Down Under Mining Conference its cornerstone. Assistant Minister of Trade, Tourism and Investment, Mark Colton, is looking forward to taking part later this month. Clearly, the Indo-Pacific is a dynamic region offering Australia very significant opportunities. Our Indo-Pacific framing is also, of course, about the security and stability that underpins opportunity. As the White Paper says, open sea lanes link the Pacific and Indian Oceans, enabling trade in goods and energy that fuels the region's growth. Over 80% of China's crude oil imports and up to 90% of Japan's oil imports are shipped through the Indian Ocean. These economies will seek the strongest possible guarantee of their access to energy supplies. It's very much in Australia's interest that they find such a guarantee in robust cooperative arrangements for freedom of navigation backed by international law. This is the norm we are seeking to establish in the Indian Ocean and to protect in the Pacific Ocean. The conciliation process we successfully concluded with Timor-Leste on our common maritime boundary is an example for the international community of how international law reinforces stability and enables countries to resolve their disputes peacefully. Indian Ocean littoral states are united in their desire to establish this norm strongly, as was evident in the Indian Ocean Conference I attended in Colombo last year. The will is there, but the institutional arrangements are not yet where they need to be. Australia has worked intensively with Indonesia and India over the past 6 years to build the capacity and sharpen the strategic focus of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA. Countries of the Indian Ocean can learn lessons from ASEAN's success. Australia is pushing ahead with its strategic agenda, including through cooperation with Indian Ocean countries to combat illegal fishing and transnational crime, and to increase maritime security capacity of navies and coast guards. We've also established a network of mini-lateral dialogues, including with Indonesia and India, and separately India and France, aimed at building architecture and cooperation in the Indian Ocean region. As always, we pursue our positive agenda with all the strength and skill and resourcefulness we can muster, while also preparing for less positive outcomes. The Indo-Pacific is full of opportunity, but it is not without risk. As the Prime Minister said in launching the Foreign Policy White Paper, at this time of change, more than ever, Australia must be sovereign, not reliant. We must take responsibility, I'm still quoting the Prime Minister, we must take responsibility for our own security and prosperity, while recognising that we are stronger when sharing the burden of leadership with trusted partners and friends, end quote. WA Defence Establishment, in particular Australia's largest naval base, HMAS Stirling on Garden Island, make an important contribution. I note also our important and successful Pacific Patrol Boat program supplied by Perth's own Austal Shipbuilders. Our defence export strategy will help Australian defence suppliers access new markets and generate a portfolio of work that will support their growth through the peaks and troughs of Australia's own defence supply needs. As always, strict controls will be in place to ensure that our defence activity meets international obligations and serves our national interest. Finally, a word on our strength as a nation. Our domestic policies and debate matter a great deal for our foreign policy. Western Australia plays a crucial leading role. If I may generalise, Western Australians understand Asia and its increasing importance to us. You understand that Australia still needs trade and investment if we're to fulfil our potential. Western Australia surely wins the prize of being our most outwardly focused state. The trade statistics would certainly support this claim. The state's contributions during White Paper consultations, including in Geraldton, were invaluable. It's an ongoing conversation which I believe Western Australian voices should lead. It's an asset to have our Pacific and Indian Ocean US centres adding their different perspectives to the national debate that is so important in shaping Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy and enabling us to seize the opportunities before us. Thank you.